Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Bryles Johnson with the North Carolina Commission on Volunteerism and Community Service. We're happy to host this webinar today about FEMA's Public Assistance Program for Houses of Worship. So I'd like to go ahead and get us started. I'm going to introduce one of our panelists, which is Phil Triplett, who is our state's volunteer agency liaison, who will introduce our guest speaker. So Phil, you're up.
Thank you, Bryles. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me from wherever you happen to be, and I really appreciate you being here and getting the information that has been confusing to some people, and in my work out in the counties with long-term recovery, misinformation and all kinds of things going on, and that's what we're hoping to help clear and clarify this afternoon. So we really appreciate you being here. If you know people that were unable to attend and want to let them know later on, the link will be shared to the recording of this session so that people can either go back and review it or see it for the first time, though they won't be able to ask questions like you will be able to with Mary. Mary Glasscock is actually with NCORE, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. She used to be in public assistance back in a few days ago or years ago, about a year, I guess, something like that, and made the move, but she has come back to PA to help out in several areas, one of them being with houses of worship. And in discussing some of the things that were coming up that were bothering a lot of people, Mary agreed quickly to share what she knows and put it hopefully in language that everybody can easily understand, so that you'll be aware of how to register through the portal and know realistically what requirements are there, as well as what you're eligible for. With that, I'll turn it over to Mary, and we really appreciate you being here this afternoon, Mary.
Thanks so much, Phil, and thank you, Bryles, as well, for working all of this out. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Glasscock, and Phil was right on the second go. I have been with North Carolina Emergency Management now for about 3 months, assisting, but I have been with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, managing CDBG DR funds for public infrastructure projects for, it's been about a year now. I do miss the public assistance side of things, I will tell you, because the FEMA program, quite frankly, does a great deal of good. When we think about FEMA showing up, we typically think about individual assistance, people in their houses, whether they're renting or whether they own homes, flooding and that sort of thing. What's lesser understood, I'm sorry to say, is the public assistance program, which is for public infrastructure and certain eligible private nonprofits, of which houses of worship are one of those sectors that are typically deemed private nonprofits, a 501c3 most often, but sometimes a 501d or E in categories in certain states at any rate. So for the state of North Carolina, what we'd like to do is get as many houses of worship registered as possible. Why? Because you don't differ except in one aspect, and we'll get on that in just a minute. You don't differ in any other way. So for example, if we have a hurricane, and since we just started hurricane season, let's start there, and then I'm going to get right into my presentation. If there's a hurricane and your facility or facilities are flooded, for example, FEMA will pay for certain things insofar as you are judged or deemed, I shouldn't say judged, deemed eligible by FEMA, and you can provide the documentation that show that you are in fact a 501c3 and you have a charter or bylaws or so on that FEMA needs to see to make sure you are eligible. But if you flood, FEMA will replace furniture, contents, remediate mold, which can be quite expensive, and also help with things in advance of something like a hurricane making landfall. COVID-19 was a very unusual event for the state. We are only allowed to request costs as they pertain to emergency protective measures. We're going to get a little bit into that as well. But we would love to see more houses of worship around the state, all 100 counties, be registered within the FEMA grants portal and being determined eligible for public assistance program dollars. And my hope is that you all are going to ask questions, which we can get to at the end of the presentation, I believe. And if any are hanging, we'll make sure to take care of those and get that to you as well. So what can the FEMA Public Assistance Program do for your house? Again, it has to do with public infrastructure. And faith-based organizations have been determined as an essential social service. And what that means is, and houses of worship were not always eligible for FEMA public assistance. In fact, I believe that they were only determined or added to lists of entities that are eligible for public assistance at the beginning of Hurricane Florence. They were not eligible, to my mind, in Matthew, but quite honestly, I don't recall off the top of my head. At any rate, they're eligible for FEMA public assistance. The public assistance program, typically, if there's a disaster declaration, the public assistance program will reimburse 75% of eligible disaster-specific costs. In other states, the remaining 25% is on the local government, the house of worship, the county, the Native American tribe. But in the state of North Carolina, historically, the state has picked up that remaining 25%. The grants will help pay for emergency protective measures, debris operations, both of which are usually on a county or a local government, and then what's called permanent work, categories C through G. We'll get into those a little bit further, but remember how I said if your house of worship has a facility that's flooded, it could be, provided that all of the maintenance has been done in advance of the disaster making landfall, that FEMA will come in and take care of 75% of the costs for example, pews, or perhaps any kind of choir area, or anything that might be in a vestibule. So we'll talk about that a little bit further. North Carolina Emergency Management is involved because the public assistance program dollars that are provided to us by FEMA are handled or moved through North Carolina Emergency Management as the recipient of those funds. Remember how I mentioned a difference. While a house of worship has been determined to be an essential social service, a house of worship is not, though I've had many folks debate this with me, and I agree in many ways, is not determined a critical private nonprofit. Critical private nonprofits are hospitals, volunteer fire departments, those first responders. And we know that houses of worship do tend to show up early. And while a lot of what a house of worship does on the front end is extremely helpful to their communities, it is not always the case that they are eligible for FEMA public assistance. And we want to make sure that you are eligible for FEMA public assistance. But to be eligible for FEMA public assistance in the first place, you want to make sure that you have a document that states, either from the IRS or from the North Carolina Secretary of State, that you are indeed a bona fide private nonprofit. Typically, that's through a ruling letter. You should be owned or operated by a private nonprofit organization and not a for-profit organization, because for-profits are never eligible for FEMA public assistance funding. The damages that were sustained, damages can also be costs, emergency protective measures, or the actual physical damages to your facilities, parking lots, vehicles, etc., must have been caused by a disaster that was declared first by the local government and then ultimately by the President of the United States, making it a federally declared disaster event in the state of North Carolina. And as a non-critical private nonprofit, the final thing that you have to do is apply to the Small Business Administration, or the SBA, for a disaster loan. The SBA makes that very easy. Disaster declarations, there's a website. You pick the disaster that you've been involved with your costs, and you must apply to the SBA first and either have been denied funding or receive insufficient funding by way of a very low interest loan. Then FEMA would come in and cover what the SBA would not, much like FEMA would come in and cover what your insurance did not. Damages, costs, and projects. So if you are eligible, according to FEMA, going into the grants portal and requesting a registration, and FEMA goes through the vetting process, and everything's in order, and you are an eligible subrecipient of FEMA funds, Then you have projects that you would also submit through the FEMA grants portal, working with FEMA and your state counterpart with the NCEM Public Assistance Program. For a project to even be considered by FEMA, the damaged element must have been caused by the declared event or the disaster. COVID-19 was very different because it wasn't something that involved physical damages, rather environmental damages. But there are a variety of different types of disasters that FEMA will cover. The damage must have occurred within a designated disaster area. Those are typically counties, and you'll understand that a little bit more in just a moment. For the state of North Carolina to be granted a disaster declaration, the damages must have reached, the damage costs must have reached at least $14 million. That's not difficult when a disaster makes landfall. For example, Florence, I believe, is going to shake out to be about $1 billion federal disaster declaration. What can be difficult and not so obvious is on the front end. Counties may be obviously so damaged that they don't even need a damage assessment done, and they're part of that damage declaration. Typically those with a hurricane or the counties that are on the east. But as we come to the central portion of the state, those counties must prove that they have met a threshold. And then if they get on board of that disaster declaration, then any eligible entity within that county would also be considered for that disaster declaration. The damage costs that have been incurred must be your legal responsibility at the time the disaster made landfall. So in other words, you own it, you lease it, and you have a document stating that you have legal responsibility or authority. We're going to talk about authority in a moment too. So with very few exceptions, the damage must have occurred at a facility in active use. So if you lease a building and it's sitting empty the day before a hurricane makes landfall, then the day after the disaster made landfall, if that same empty leased facility was flooded, FEMA will very likely not cover that disaster cost because it wasn't in use. With very few exceptions, the damage occurred at a facility in active use. So that, in other words, something must be actively used or in place and running at the time the disaster makes landfall. And the damage is not within the specific authority of another federal program, of which we have many. We know, for example, the CARES Act that is managed presently by the Department of Commerce, but I don't believe houses of worship have much CARES Act funding, if any at all. This is a list of private nonprofits that could potentially be eligible, and I would like for everyone to just review these for just a moment. We are doing active outreach presently for a variety of these, one of which is houses of worship arranged through Phil and Bryles, and I'm very grateful for that, as are most of us over in the public assistance program, because we know that on the eastern portion of the United States, particularly in North Carolina, the outreach has been more significant simply because of the hurricanes. We've had 4 hurricanes or tropical storms in the last 3 or 4 years. On the western and central portion of the state, it has not been so obvious, and we are trying to prioritize outreach with certain entities, of which private nonprofit hospitals and homeless shelters, food assistance programs, and houses of worship are some of those. Oh, excuse me. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about eligibility. So I've mentioned the cost thresholds may change every year. We're still working off of the 2010 census, looking forward to getting the 2020 census completed and those numbers in. So as I've said, North Carolina needs about 14,400,000. Not difficult. The county thresholds at present are $3.84 times that 2010 population number. So if you think about it, Mecklenburg County is going to have a very difficult time getting into a federal disaster declaration. All of the counties are in for COVID-19 because the costs are so high. But if it comes to a federal declaration, it's going to be a lot easier for Jones County to be part of a federal declaration because the population is lower, although damages can vary so much that all things being equal, depending upon the level of damage, it may be that Mecklenburg could very well be considered, but higher declaration numbers for different counties like Wake County or Durham County, the populations are higher, so it can be more difficult. And why I say this is because all damages count for damage assessments. So if FEMA wants us to come in and prove that we have the cost for Wake County, for example. We can do that because we've all paid attention as eligible subrecipients, and we know, and we provide those damage estimates to our county emergency manager. So every damage counts toward that county threshold. For Dorian, and right now, any other federal declaration that could come this year, one must have at least costs or damages that are directly attributable to a federal disaster declaration of at least $3,300. FEMA is very good about finding that $3,300 if at all possible. And then a large project threshold, as opposed to a small project threshold, is at $131,100. Small projects are paid on estimates. Large projects are typically paid on actuals. These are the eligible categories of work. So we've mentioned debris removal and emergency protective measures. There's an incident period. If a hurricane makes landfall on, God forbid, August the 1st, the incident period probably started for preparatory time because we knew that hurricane was coming. Some things we know are coming and other things we don't. So if a hurricane makes landfall on August the 1st, it may be that the declaration date starts in advance. FEMA says, oh, let's take it back to July 15th. We knew that hurricane was coming toward North Carolina. Folks had 15 days to prepare. Those costs within that window for emergency work, protective measures, category B work, would be eligible starting on July the 15th. The incident period, there may be flooding that comes after a hurricane. So typically FEMA will have a 30 or 60-day incident period. For example, July 15th, preparatory time, disaster makes landfall on August 1st, and FEMA carries that incident period on to August the 30th. That is typically the way a timeline will work for an incident period. Incident periods are very important to FEMA Public Assistance. The categories of work for FEMA for permanent work: C, roads and bridges, that includes culverts. D, water control facilities, those are dams, dikes, and levees. E, buildings and equipment, that includes contents, parking lots. As long as you have legal authority or you have a legal responsibility to take care of those items, then they could be eligible for cost reimbursement. Utilities, this is private nonprofit utilities like cooperatives that pick up where a private entity like Progress Energy leaves off. Parks, recreation, and other. Playgrounds, for example. Eligible costs within FEMA. I just wanted to provide you all a little bit of what could be eligible. Provided you are eligible and it's happened, the cost has been incurred because of an action or a damage, a physical damage directly related to a disaster, federal declaration, disaster, rented equipment that you need, temporary staff that you bring on, or supplies that you need to buy and put on your shelves could be eligible cost reimbursement expenses. Transportation of evacuees between facilities, taking someone from, for example, an eligible county that needs to be removed from a certain type of a shelter to another county in a county that has not been made part of a disaster declaration because it's in higher ground. Those could be eligible expenses, the transportation of folks, even if they have to go in ambulances or however they need to go. As long as FEMA deems it reasonable, it could be eligible. Fixing a parking lot that's owned by you or leased by you, and you have a legal responsibility over it. Replacing contents or furniture, mold remediation, or fixing a grass and dirt playground that may be out behind a house of worship that is part of an eligible subrecipient facility. Everything washes away. And it is in fact the case that FEMA may add what's called 406 or hazard mitigation dollars to your project. So permeable, say not AstroTurf, but a more solid and resilient playground is put in place for the future. Why would FEMA do that? FEMA adds hazard mitigation dollars if it is deemed eligible, of course. If there is, then there are certain rules that must be in play. But if you have a playground that's been damaged and washed away, FEMA may not only fix how the playground was in advance of the disaster making landfall, taking it back to what they call pre-disaster declaration, but add those mitigation dollars, because why should FEMA come back and pay for the same thing over and over and over? cost-benefit analysis over the past few disasters that have occurred over the past 10 years have shown us that it wastes money for FEMA to pay over and over and over to take something back all the time to pre-disaster condition, when it just takes a bit more money to make it more resilient or harden a permanent work project for future disasters of a similar type. Those mitigation dollars, hazard mitigation dollars, are not part of category A or category B or those temporary protective measures, but rather only permanent work categories. Ineligible, increased operating cost or lost revenue. Landfills waive tipping fees. This is something that happens during a natural disaster. Trees are down everywhere, and a county government, out of the kindness of their heart, wants to waive those tipping fees. Well, FEMA will not reimburse a landfill, a county-owned landfill, for what the county did not pay for. So we advise landfills not to waive their tipping fees, because otherwise they're out a great deal of money that FEMA would ordinarily have funded. Events canceled. If you had a space that you rented for an event, for example, we're seeing this with COVID-19 with stadiums, where something was rented or leased for a concert, and then that concert was canceled because of COVID-19. Those event cancellations and the costs that were lost, or the revenue that was lost, is not eligible for FEMA reimbursement. Individual meals or group outings. Work of the entire cost for equipment. In other words, if you need to buy a backhoe because you don't have a backhoe, FEMA will not pay for the whole thing for future mitigation. They will pay you for the portion on sort of a prorated basis that you used for days or hours, because everything has a cost, including equipment. And there are equipment cost listings that can be provided to you upon request. Work on facilities that are unreasonably restrictive to others. For example, country clubs or homeowners associations are likely never eligible for FEMA public assistance programs, because unless I can get in there and others cannot get in there, if I can't get in and others can't get in, that's too restrictive. Worker actions taken without an agreement in place. We've seen where DHHS has provided authority to the state of North Carolina and other states on the federal DHHS has provided authority to turn on faucets of funding, including FEMA public assistance, but there must be a reason for someone to do work for someone else. For example, emergency operations centers that are open to assist with COVID-19 were done because we have a federal declaration and because DHHS has said we must go forward and continue with emergency operations. So there must be authority and agreements in place in writing. I'm going to get to a stopping point, and then I'm going to ask if Bryles or Phil would like to put a couple of questions to me, or if we should just keep going. I'm going to get to a stopping point here in 2 slides. Duplication of benefit is never allowed for any federal program, and FEMA typically views the public assistance funding as a funder of last resort. That is not the case for COVID-19. We have been advised that the CARES Act funding for hospitals and local governments and counties are in fact the funders of last resort. That is managed through the North Carolina Department of Commerce. That being said, if you receive funding, for example, from the USDA for a meals program that you may have in your local government, of which your house of worship assists with feeding children, because when they go to school, that's when they get their meals, or the summer food service program that's managed by the Department of Public Instruction that receives their money from USDA. If that funding comes from USDA, FEMA cannot duplicate that funding with a program that provides nutrition services to folks, because it has already been funded. There are above and beyond costs, though, that are not considered increased operating costs that are made, quote, special costs because of a disaster event. You should always talk to your grant manager about that. And by the way, you'll know who your grant managers are in your counties here in a little bit. Having authority. A lot of times a house of worship, as I said a little bit earlier, we know that houses of worship typically go out on the front end of disaster events because they know their communities best. Houses of worship and emergency managers typically know their communities best. That being said, FEMA wants to help. This is the thing that a sentence I have at the bottom. But FEMA must follow the Stafford Act, the 44 CFR, 2 CFR, and all of these other laws, rules, and regulations that are in place. We want to do things out of the kindness of our heart, but it doesn't mean that FEMA or the federal government will fund something unless there is authority. I've given you 3 good examples there. These are circumstances that a house of worship may find themselves in, where there's an issue in a local community, an unincorporated community, or a community that floods. You always want to have authority, because typically a county or a local government is more used to having the funding and the budget to provide these 3 things. But if it is in fact the case that you would like to offer these services, you must have authority from your county or local government in order to be considered by FEMA Public Assistance funding, for FEMA Public Assistance funding rather. So authority is something else to have entirely. So I'm going to stop right here, because we're going to go right into how do I try to get with the FEMA Public Assistance Program, get vetted, and go into this grants portal. I'm going to stop here and see if Bryles has any questions for me, or if anybody would like to put anything forward, or if I should just continue on. Bryles?
At this time, I don't have any questions in the chat box. If anybody, oh, we do have a hand raised here. Hold on one second. All right, this is Gregory Gilliam. I'm going to unmute you, Gregory. You should be unmuted so you can ask a question.
Yes, how you doing, Mary? My name is Pastor Gregory Gilliam. I'm in Bertie County, and we have gone through several floods at our house of worship, our church. And I develop a plan now to where that we are partnering with somebody like U-Haul. Before a flood come in, we take all of our furnishing and all those different things out of the church. Then will FEMA reimburse for the use of a U-Haul due to something of that nature?
Yes, sir, they would. In fact, to move things to higher ground, in Bertie County in particular, I've been over to Bertie many times. And for example, if you are you already registered in the grants portal? Have you ever submitted costs for this kind of thing? I'm thinking not.
No, I haven't, but we have had a small business loan due to a hurricane in the past. We have a undergoing small business loan from the SBA.
So this is all an excellent exercise in understanding, Pastor Gilliam, I believe it is. I think the best thing that you can do is get registered with FEMA Public Assistance. And remember, you've got to be able to show that you are in fact a bona fide private nonprofit. There's a charter and all these things that you need to submit for that. It's really quite simple. And then yes, FEMA will. Emergency protective measures are typically protective measures that take place in advance of something making landfall. So no matter the type of declaration, if we know it's coming, and as long as, and this is very key, as long as it is determined to be reasonable from a cost perspective and from an action perspective, then FEMA will very likely look at that seriously for funding. And I hate to use those words, very likely, may, could, but the fact is I don't want to make any promises, because we have a lot of misinformation about what FEMA can and cannot do from a public assistance program. And there are many laws and regulations, but it is up to the state, NCEM, public assistance, to help you better understand those through webinars like this. I hope that is helpful, and I hope that you also and others submit for the public assistance program to be considered as an eligible subrecipient.
Yes, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I think there's a question about the PowerPoint being made available. Absolutely. You'll have that. I'm going to provide it to Bryles and to Phil, and we'll get that out just as soon as we can. Is there anything else?
We have another question here from Madeline Goldfarb. I'm going to unmute you now. Go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much. My question is, for a house of worship which did not take any governmental funding and therefore was not required under the ADA to be accessible, now by becoming a subrecipient and taking federal funds, would they then be required, or would then the ADA and all of the codes and standards kick in that they have taken federal funds now?
That's an excellent question, Ms. Goldfarb, and the answer to that is that would absolutely come into play. So if you have ADA funding, and I'm so sorry if there's a lot of feedback. If it is in fact the case that you have been told, if I understand correctly, and correct me on this, Ms. Goldfarb, if you will, is the SBA funding so you can upgrade to ADA compliance?
The question is, previously, as a house of worship, not taking any sort of governmental funds in the past, that house of worship would not have been required to apply ADA codes and standards to their facility. The question I have is, now they've become an eligible applicant and potentially are taking government funding, would that house of worship now be required to apply the ADA standards?
Yes, that is accurate. It used to be, as with the NFIP insurance that is required, it is in fact the case that sometimes, and this has been a difficult piece that has not been carried across on an equivalent basis throughout the regions as FEMA determines them. And by the way, we're in Region 4. As FEMA looks at various entities' eligibility, it is the case that sometimes FEMA will give you a pass. And it depends on what the codes and standards are. If they're wildly out of compliance, and I can't believe you're wildly out of compliance, but if they're wildly out of compliance, FEMA may say, no, we're not going to do this. But if you are, for example, if you have electrical outlets that are out of compliance and are too low, it may be that FEMA Public Assistance gives a whole group of folks a pass in an area because they did not keep up with codes and standards, simply because of other extenuating circumstances. ADA compliance is required for anything moving forward, for example. So if you were flooded and you don't have ADA compliance in place, FEMA may very well pay to fix something, but they might ding you if you don't have ADA in place, ADA compliance in place, like, for example, access, ingress and egress.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, now we have a question from Melvin Williams. You are now unmuted.
Yes, Mary, can you explain the difference between on the earlier slide you have 501C, D, and E?
I can. Anybody can go on to like Google, and if you like, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share. No, I'm not going to be able to share an application. A 501C, for example, is a charity. A 501D, I believe, is a utility. And I don't even know what a 501E is, but I would love it if somebody would Google 501D. Phil, maybe you can do that, or 501E, because I don't have those memorized.
So with the E, is that the one where you can, I think part of the eligibility requirement for FEMA is that you cannot lobby, but a D, you can participate in a political activity, which would deem you not eligible if you are a D, because it could be looked at as lobbying.
Under no circumstances will FEMA allow an entity that would otherwise be eligible. For example, there are certain foundations and associations that will not be eligible for FEMA because they're lobbying arms. There are other Ds that are deemed eligible because they do not get involved in political caucusing or lobbying. So we do have Ds and Es that are eligible insofar as they are not certain types of associations or I would say groups or that involve several types of different political activities. So FEMA will never reimburse any entity that is involved with the politic side of things.
And then the second part of the question, you talked earlier in the presentation about what FEMA can fix. I think you was talking about pews and different things within the sanctuary. Can you elaborate a little more for them on the how the insurance works?
Well, any house of worship or any type of an eligible subrecipient for that matter, very likely has insurance in place. And if you don't have insurance in place, but you're supposed to, as with NFIP flood insurance and you're in a flood zone, for example, if you don't have NFIP insurance and you're flooded, and let's say you have $500,000 worth of permanent damage, right? So think of your own facility and imagine what's inside of it. Windows, a pulpit, vestibules, any kind of furniture, rugs, anything like that, floors, a roof. If you do not have the right kind of insurance, or if you're not insured and you're supposed to have certain types of insurance according to laws and regulations like the NFIP insurance or wind-driven rain insurance, if it's a wind-driven rain event, and you have $500,000 worth of damage, FEMA's going to write that project worksheet for $500,000, but then they're going to do this thing that's going to seem horrible. If you were supposed to have had $100,000 worth of insurance and you didn't, FEMA's going to put a minus $100,000 in there. And that's going to be what FEMA has determined is your actual, what you should have had for actual insurance. So then FEMA would likely fund about $400,000. The painful thing is there are lots of local governments and others, particularly private nonprofits, that have not been able to afford certain types of insurance. It used to be that FEMA gave you a path, as with ADA compliance that Ms. Goldfarb mentioned. FEMA no longer gives passes for not having the proper type of insurance in place. So you will receive a reduction. And if you are told to obtain and maintain insurance, you will not be allowed, unless you obtain and maintain that type of insurance that FEMA advises you on, you will not be allowed to apply that, use that facility with future damages. You will not be able to submit cost for reimbursement. Bryles, do we need to continue to move forward and hold on some questions, or I'm not real sure how we are with the timing?
I think so far, I think that we should be good. I'll go ahead. Let's see. Mr. Gillen, your hand is still up. Do you have another question?
No,
You're
I
unmuted.
apologize. Yeah, I don't have another question.
Okay, just want to make sure we had you covered. Okay, let's, I guess we're ready to move on.
Great. So to register for FEMA Public Assistance, and when I say register, remember you got to go through the vetting process. The state will review your paperwork and deem you eligible or not. And then FEMA will do that. FEMA is always the decision maker on whether a private nonprofit or any entity is eligible or not. Oh, excuse me, I got off the slide. So easy to do. If you want to be considered for FEMA Public Assistance funding, remember FEMA pays down through North Carolina Emergency Management, and there's a whole team of us that are working for, if you will, for FEMA as the recipient of those funds. We also will help you get registered. Please don't try to register yourself. You want to email the name of your organization, the best contact name, phone number, and email address. And then also you're going to want to indicate whether or not you are tax exempt as a 501c or D or E. Most of you will be C as charities, or otherwise determined to be tax exempt through the North Carolina Secretary of State with a letter from that Secretary of State. If you'd like, in that email that you're going to email to pahotline@ncem.org. You can also call a grants manager in your county because you're going to see those toward the end. You also want to, if you look at the bottom of this slide, provide articles of incorporation, charter, bylaws, proof of insurance, ownership or legal responsibility, and that certification or letter. If they're not too big, you can attach those, but otherwise all you have to do is indicate whether or not you are tax exempt in one of those two ways, through the IRS or the Secretary of State. Also in the chat, Phil has Googled and provided us a little bit more about 501D and 501E, of which I don't think any of us are as a house of worship. Now, I provide a little bit more for you. We do this for everyone because some folks will not state clearly in the subject line. I recommend putting grants portal registration. That's just my idea of what to put in the subject line. Remember, it's got to be pahotline@ncem.org. The organization, the contact name, the contact phone, the contact email, and as a private nonprofit, add whether you're a 501c3 or 501 whatever, or through the Secretary of State. So that's just a screenshot for you all so you know. After you send that email, typically within 48 hours, and bear in mind there's a lot going on with FEMA presently. And so through that, of course, there's a lot going on all over the United States, particularly with COVID-19, but typically still within 48 hours, you're going to receive an email from an entity that you've never heard of before. And that email is going to come from support.pagrants@fema.gov. There's going to be a link in there that you're going to click on, and it's going to ask you to, when you open that link, You're going to submit more information and documentation as defined here. So this is the process that will get you first level registered with FEMA and on everyone's radar. And that's when the vetting process starts. And you're going to be doing it in the grants portal. The grants portal, I've provided you a little screenshot of what that looks like in the lower right-hand corner. And I've also provided you what the email is going to look like. The from is going to say, again, support.pa at FEMAgrantsportal.gov or something similar to that. And I want to make certain that you all check your spam, if you know your spam, or I don't think it's trash, or junk email, because sometimes an email that looks like this will land really quickly in spam or junk. So you see the link that you click on to start the registration, and that's exactly what's going to happen. And when you do that, it's going to pop open a website that looks like where the red arrow is pointing to. So finally, FEMA and state resources. These are some links that are going to be very helpful to you. The guide that we go by is called the FEMA Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. This is policy. There's also regulations like the 44 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, and then everything that FEMA Public Assistance does stems from the Stafford Act, which goes back, I believe Jimmy Carter was the president to formalize the Stafford Act, and it's gone through a revision relatively recently, one of which was adding houses of worship and daycare centers as eligible subrecipients of FEMA Public Assistance funding. Then we have the FEMA Grants Portal videos. Once you get registered, if you want to know how to do different things, and I believe even including the registration portion, you can go and watch those videos. And then finally, specific guidance, including house guidance for houses of worship. FEMA has a great deal of good guidance and videos for us, as does North Carolina Emergency Management. So at the first, North Carolina Public Assistance Program has its own website, which takes you to some very pointed facts about what eligibility means. And also reasonableness from a cost perspective and an action perspective. Is what you're doing reasonable, and are the costs reasonable? It should be what the market would bear under the circumstances. North Carolina Emergency Management Grants Portal registration step by step. There's a video for that. So what we just went through, if you'd like to watch that again, the video is there and you'll have access to it through this PowerPoint. And then finally, the University of North Carolina School of Government has provided us what's called a procurement website. When federal money comes to town, it's a very different story than if it is local or state funds. Federal funding requires more stringent consideration of how we put something out to bid. So for example, if the synagogue or the temple or the church was damaged, let's say the roof blew off and the insurance covers it, and FEMA's going to cover the rest of it, and not only cover the rest of it, they're going to provide some mitigation funding so you have a roof that is more resilient against the wind or more resilient against whatever might be coming our way in the future, because it's a mitigative action that they're going to add those dollars to. It is in fact the case that when federal money is in town, you must follow something called the Code of Federal Regulations. And that means that you have to put something out to bid 3 times, for example, before you can determine which entity or company you're going to go with. You must also put it on the HUB website. That is the North Carolina Department of Administration's historically underutilized business website to reach women and minority-owned businesses. There are several things we must do when federal funding comes to town. And bear in mind, FEMA Public Assistance money may start the flow of funding for other pots of federal money that come to town, whether it's the Economic Development Administration's funding or perhaps CDBG-DR, disaster recovery funding. We want to make sure that we do things right on the front end with procurement and contracting according to 2 CFR. To that end, the UNC School of Government, we've got some very bright people who are telling us step by step how to manage that when federal funding comes to town. The contacts for North Carolina Emergency Management's Public Assistance Program. Here's a field map. The map is divided into 3 regions. That's further divided into areas. And if you look and see, you've got contact information, or you will have contact information for all of those areas and the counties within those areas. So if your county is ever declared eligible for a federal disaster declaration moving forward, and you've got eligible costs and eligible work, you're going to receive, once you're registered in the grants portal, you're going to receive a ding in the form of an email alert that says your county is now eligible for public assistance. Click here to submit a request for reimbursement or a RPA. That's a request for public assistance, and it is required every time there is a federal declaration. So you'd want to watch out for that if you are ever eligible and in the FEMA grants portal. That's why we have to be in the grants portal. But if you have any questions about any of this, everyone has a grants manager for their county. And there's also cell phone numbers and email addresses with supervisors and others that are part of the FEMA Public Assistance Program. And then finally, that's me. As Phil mentioned, I'm kind of going between two agencies presently. There's my email address. I would ask that you're probably going to get a much quicker answer because there's a whole lot going on right now on my end where we're onboarding a software system for payment processing. Right now, it's more or less done by hand. And then also we're working with a great many others. Your grants managers are going to be your first line of defense. And then I'm going to open it up right now for questions.
Okay, if anybody has a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to unmute you.
And this is Phil. I just wanted people to know that I did put in the chat box the definition of a 501D and a 501E, if you'd like to read that.
Browse, I want you to know that I'm very, very appreciative for this, and I'm sure there are more questions. Also, more than happy for Browse and Phil both, more than happy to do more webinars. We could, in fact, we're going to provide this PowerPoint to you for dissemination. Can do more webinars, getting more in depth into, say, the categories of work or more about eligibility in specific scenarios or procurement. Or what is an emergency protective measure for a non-critical but essential private nonprofit. So more than willing to do that as well, in addition to answering any questions that may come your way when the webinar is finished.
Great, thank you for that. Oh, nope, we do have a question. We have Mr. Gillum again. All right, you are unmuted. Feel free to ask your question.
Yes, I just want to say to Mary once again. Mary, thank you so much for bringing such much needed information to the citizens of North Carolina because like I said, my church had went through a flood and it was such a devastating event, very traumatic because there wasn't no guided portal to help guide you. It was something that I had to wing on my own, and it was a very stressful and traumatic time. But with all this information that you're providing, it helps prepare us for future events and make the transition a whole lot easier. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Pastor Gilliam. I'm very grateful for you saying that truly, because I know that if we look at this map and we look at all of these counties, it is in fact the case that we have not reached a lot of houses of worship. It is a very new onboarding houses of worship for the eligibility. And I know that something like this particular webinar that we're doing now may pick your interest, but it didn't answer all your questions. And of course, Browse and Phil and I know that. So if you have any questions, we would love your feedback on this. You know, winging it is something that a lot of us have to do during disasters, and it's a very uncomfortable process for so many. And I want to make certain, we all want to make certain, everyone you see on this list and supervisors that are with North Carolina Emergency Management and leadership all the way to the top want to make sure that you all are far more comfortable with public assistance than in the past. And we know that can happen, but it takes repetition and it takes feedback. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a few more minutes if anybody has a question. Feel free to raise your hand. Oh, we do have a question here from Taranya Zell. How does the funding work in terms of preparation for churches to reopen safely in light of COVID-19?
So when you talk about reopening safely, we have to make certain, this is where it gets sticky, and I'm glad you've asked this question. COVID-19 is a particularly unusual event because I can't think of any time that I've ever experienced anything but a natural disaster. So we have to pay attention to the governor's executive orders. And we have to pay attention because the governor is allowing the counties and the local governments to make a lot of their own decisions. We have to consider that for federal funding, if you are, in fact, and I do want to let you all know, the incident period is in fact open. It is never a problem you can register with FEMA anytime. You can do it now. You could do it in 6 months. I advise, of course, you do it sooner rather than later. When it comes to COVID-19, that incident period is still open. Emergency protective measures typically have more to do with patients or keeping people apart from one another by way of non-congregate sheltering. But as with mold remediation or mosquito abatement that FEMA could potentially fund, and that's usually always on the county. The county is the one that's supposed to have, like, for example, mosquito abatement programs in place. But when it comes to mold remediation, that would be on you. And you want to make certain that you have the ability and the wherewithal just to submit that project, because your grants manager is certainly going to assist you. With COVID-19, what is it that you envision doing that is in fact a protective measure that you don't have to go to the SBA for first? When a category B disaster is declared, like with COVID-19, even non-critical private nonprofits don't have to go to SBA. So I do want to clarify that there are some things, permanent work, that you'd have to go to the SBA for with a hurricane. If, for example, you have permanent work from damages incurred according to by that federal disaster that made landfall. But with category B, what is it that you envision doing to keep people safe? And I ask any house of worship that. What is it that you would like to do that you feel would be necessary and you could try to submit to FEMA for? Because we don't have all of the answers about what could potentially be eligible at this point because of the uniqueness of this event. If anybody has anything they'd like to throw out there. Local governments, for example, understand that they have to keep people farther apart for X amount of time. Could go for another year, could go for longer, maybe shorter. Nobody really knows, I think, at this point. But if you follow models, it could be quite some time. So local governments know that in waiting areas, they need to expand their footprint. We don't know how much of that yet FEMA is going to deem eligible for a local government. So we would have the same answer for a house of worship, of course. But is there anything else that you can think of that you could submit? The best thing I could do is say, try it. Get eligible and submit that project through the FEMA grants portal now while the incident period is still open. I love to give yes or no's, by the way, but on this, it is not always the case. That is a yes or no, simply because it's a policy question. FEMA is ultimately going to make the determination, but sometimes FEMA will pay attention to what is going on a grander scale within a region or within a sector of eligible subrecipients. So Bryles, there is the question. I'm sorry, it can't be a yes or a no there.
Okay, I think that's fine. Okay, folks, we're wrapping up here. Last chance for questions, and as always, you can follow up with us with any questions that may come up later. Okay, all right. Well, I think that should pretty much wrap it up. Phil, do you have any last words?
I just appreciate everybody that took the time to be here. It's been a long time coming putting this together, and I appreciate the response and all the people that have attended and the questions. Not sure everybody heard it earlier, but in the chat box, I did put the definition of a 501D and a 501E. And there's also an example I found of a 501D. That was kind of interesting because it was created for the Shakers and similar religious groups. So that's out there. I have the presentation set so that we can get that out. We'll find a way to get that out to you and make sure that you have a copy of it. And anything that you need, just let us know. We'll be more than happy to see if we can find the information for you. I really like the fact that you can sign up or sign into the portal now and get set up. before the next hurricane comes, because we all unfortunately know it's going to happen. And that will save time, because as I tell long-term recovery groups, exchanging business cards during a storm is not a good idea. So anything you can do ahead of time like this, getting set up in the portal, is going to put you miles ahead of the people that did not.
That's right.
Getting everything prepared. So I do appreciate it.
Okay, we have a quick question that came up. Will FEMA provide deep cleaning for houses of worship before reopening?
So if you are already doing cleaning, for example, and that, by the way, FEMA doesn't like the word cleaning. FEMA likes the word disinfecting, and sometimes words count, right? So if you are already cleaning and you're now doing disinfecting, it could be as an emergency protective measure. I'm going to tell you, that's something you should absolutely submit. And if they don't fund that, I would love to hear the reason why they don't fund that. Yes, in many instances, I know particularly with hospitals. Now, a hospital is a critical private nonprofit, but hospitals are in fact for disinfecting. Police stations, fire departments, other critical private nonprofits are receiving funding for the disinfecting of facilities, wiping things down, and the chemicals, the labor. If labor is paid, if it's volunteer labor, there's no reimbursement because nothing was paid for. But there is a thing called donated resources as well. So I'd try it once I get eligible, that's for sure.
So we had a follow-up about reimbursed. They've already sanitized. I think you just covered that, but maybe you can go ahead.
If they did it between, if sanitizing or disinfecting, let's call it sanitizing, that's a much better word. A sanitizing took place after the incident period, which I believe was January the 10th. So if it took place then, we're still in the incident period. So if you get eligible, submit a request for public assistance because that is still open to you, and submit those costs. It would be best to, make a case for it, include the cost for the chemicals and anything else that you needed, of supplies, materials, equipment. And as long as it's deemed reasonable and eligible and with reasonable costs, submit it through and you might be surprised. I mean, it could very well be eligible for houses of worship, like it would be for anyone else.
Great, thank you. So far, I do not see any more questions coming through, so I guess we can go ahead and wrap this up. I want to thank both Phil and Mary for your time and for this very informative, excellent presentation. I do hope that there will be some follow-up from you all, and if there's a request for another webinar, we will be happy to try to put something together. Oh, I do have one other thing. Just came in from Anita. It says, I am not a house of worship, but want to know if this presentation will be similar for a community development organization.
When we say community development organization, if you are talking about a private nonprofit, this first of all, what you've been watching here and what we've been discussing, you, depending upon the type of organization, and provided you can, give the documentation through the FEMA grants portal after you submit, very likely it is the same because it is a private nonprofit. Whether you are critical or non-critical, I cannot say because I don't know your organization, but if you're a private nonprofit, you are very likely eligible.
Great. You said perfect. Thank you. All right. All right. Well, again, Mary, thank you so much. This presentation has been recorded, and it takes a few days to get it compiled, but we will be able to send this out to all of the registrants. And we're just glad to have you all here. And again, thank you, Mary and Phil. Any last thoughts from you all?
I just wanted to say how grateful I am to have been invited. This was all Phil's idea, so I'm going to give Phil the big kudos and thank you very much for accommodating me. Glad to do it again. One of my favorite things to do is make sure that entities who are not really familiar with public assistance get more familiar. So thank you for that.
And we appreciate you being here and being available, as well as this new reorganization with public assistance. I think we will be able to reach out and hit more houses of worship, especially dental. And as I said before, it's that sometimes you just know, so spread the word and make things available so people can view it and get a copy of it, and do ask questions. If you're not sure if you're eligible, we had just a moment ago from Ms. Bennett, is ask. That's the best way to do it. If you're not sure, just ask. And it's not a silly question as far as I'm concerned. It's a very good one, and you don't really know until you ask. So by all means, the people are available to take questions and calls and email messages, and I would utilize them to be sure I could be helped and accommodated as best as I could for my organization.
It never hurts to try.
That's right. That's right. I do appreciate it. Thank you,
Thank
Mary.
you all.
All right. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.